As the general conditions of the combat operations unfolding within Arlington had been laid out within the previous video installation, the forces partaking in this operation from the 59th PLA Group Army 16th Infantry Division were acting in accordance with the larger cluster of flank clearance operations unfolding throughout the entire metroplex, as this was an enormous amalgamation of cities with a population of just over 8 million total, the city of Arlington being one of the larger cities within this larger metropolitan area, was of massive importance to the coalition as it sat along two key arteries which would be immensely valuable for the use of logistical resupply and troop transit operations as it would pertain to the coming occupation of the nation and its economic exploitation by the CCP regime. As their forces within the DFW metro area were on the move everywhere, the forces acting within the Arlington combat operation were essentially acting to both ensure the capture of these vital segments of both I-20 in the south of Arlington and I-30 in the north of Arlington, as well as eradicate all armed opposition as it was now appearing within this particular city. As the armed elements that were now being contended with consisted primarily of armed reactionary civilians, or effectively armed and leaderless mobs that were poorly organized and uncoordinated and had no working logistical system to speak of, as these personnel were merely reacting to the invaders without thinking and without actionable intel, as the tandem anti-sat and cyber strike, as well as the onbooting of electronic warfare assets both overhead in the skies, aboard the JH-7 strike aircraft and the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, as well as the ground-based assets within the PLA 59th Group Army's own electronic warfare regiment, had completely and totally shut down through electromagnetic jamming the American redundant comms, which consisted of radio communications, as well as also their redundant radar ISR capabilities, as there were multi-mission radars and air defense radars which were not dependent on satellite or the internet to effectively function. And these systems were effectively removed by the use of these very potent and state-of-the-industry, state-of-the-art electromagnetic jamming weapons, which included those aboard the aircraft consisting of the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods aboard the JH-7 Flying Leopards and the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft. In the south of the battle, within the DFW metro area in the city of Arlington, the mechanized infantry battalions that were tasked with this flank clearance operation, which again served the dual purpose of removing large groupings of armed defenders, as well as also ensuring the seizure of a portion of both I-20 and I-30, was now well underway in two and running effectively of the key logistical stations that were set up for the oncoming external invasion prongs, as one prong of Group Armies 7 through 13 was traveling up I-35 from the border with Mexico all the way deep inland, where they would fan out within Kansas after dropping off some of their forces en route to act as heavy-handed reinforcements for the Trojan shock armies that were the deepest inland. The same was the case in the north as other invasion prongs moved down from Canada. They would meet in the middle of the nation as they would fan out and aid the Trojan shock forces already there and capturing or destroying the main objectives. As it pertained to Arlington in particular, two groupings of armed reactionary civilians would be surrounded and destroyed by two different mechanized infantry battalions, with another moving up effectively into the center of Arlington, and again another in the south. As we go to the smaller maps, the eastern pocket, which was the smaller of the two pockets, effectively was comprised of roughly 300 armed reactionary civilians, which would effectively be surrounded and destroyed by one mechanized infantry battalion as it committed 4 of its companies in a direct assault against the main body of these armed reactionary civilian elements, while 2 additional companies off map effectively surrounded the area to block them in. As there was a wide variety of supporting assets at work in this operation, they consisted of JH-7 strike aircraft, which in this particular area of the map are dropping precision Baidu-guided munitions for close air support operations to destroy buildings populated with relatively large numbers of armed reactionary civilians, as these other 3 are using their twin nose cannon, their twin 23mm nose cannons, to strafe targets just off the map. As these devastating strike aircraft brought immense destruction to the battlefield, they were joined by the very potent 155mm artillery strikes that were now coming in from the PLA 16th Infantry Division's artillery battalion of PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers, as these 155mm howitzers within the first half hour were mostly firing at the Taylor Army heliport and also assisting in a kill box that was being created in neighboring Grand Prairie. They also shifted some of their fire to assist in destroying this pocket of armed reactionary civilians in the far east of Arlington, while in the west of Arlington at the football stadium, a large number of armed reactionary civilians in comparison with the 300 in the eastern pocket were roughly 1,000 in this area, were mostly within the football stadium, as they opted to turn this into a fortress of sorts, as many had the same idea at roughly the same time that they could use this structure to their advantage, as this was one of the strongest and most hardened structures in the area, and as many people from neighboring neighborhoods had flocked into this area in terms of the armed reactionary civilian elements, there were also a number of non-combatants that went into the area as well. And although the forces operating in this area of the PLA, as in one mechanized infantry battalion, which had only committed 3 mechanized infantry companies out of its 6 total mechanized infantry companies, along with its 1 fire support company and its headquarters and support company, which was the command and logistical elements over the whole battalion, were using these 3 companies with combat drone support from 2 Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drones. There were also 2 sniper spotter teams which were dispatched from the battalion's headquarters company to move into this area and assist the forces on the ground, as well as also the fire support capabilities from the battalion's own fire support company, offering heavy rocket bombardment into this parking lot, destroying many vehicles with their very potent salvos of their short-range light artillery 130mm rocket systems, the Type 63s, a very versatile, efficient, and effective weapons platform, and thus it was kept in service over many decades as a result. There were also the heavy assault gun / mortars, the 120mm PLL-05s, which could be fired in a direct fire operation as an assault gun or canted and fired as a mortar system with a range of 5.5 miles, slightly longer than the 5-mile range of the 130mm rockets. These systems as well were highly efficient and versatile systems and contributed heavily to the fire support needs of the mechanized infantry forces on the ground. As again, in the East, there was very potent air support in terms of close air support operations from the dedicated JH-7 Strike aircraft. These aircraft carried nearly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground ordnance and were a scourge against ground forces in general terms, as well as also there being a pair of J-11 fighter aircraft, which at this point in time, on their first sortie this early into the invasion, as it was now only 45 minutes in when these maps begin, in terms of the two different pockets, as they were gradually surrounded within the first 30 minutes, these fighter aircraft, armed with mostly air-to-air munitions, did carry a pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions, although they were not used unless in case of an emergency. These aircraft at this point in time were still conducting their combat air patrols over the battle space to ensure air superiority in conjunction with the forces of the 59th Air Defense Artillery Brigade of the PLA's 59th Group Army, as well as also the SHORAD battalions within each of the main maneuver elements, such as the 24th Light Infantry Brigade, the 16th Infantry Division, and, of course, again, the 35th Armored Brigade with their own SHORAD capabilities as well, all contributing to direct control over the airspace, over the battlefield. As in this map, the operations unfolding 45 minutes in consisted of loitering munitions support coming in from the battalion's own headquarters and support company's dedicated combat drone section, using their 48-tube TEL-based system to launch these loitering munitions with HE warheads, as well as also a JH-7 strike dropping 8,000 pounds of air-to-ground freefall munitions onto a large cluster of armed reactionary civilians as they entered the parking lot and began to get out of their vehicles, their technicals, in these terms, as this was a battle and a vehicle with armed men inside is effectively a technical, mostly pickup trucks and SUVs, as these were also again sighted in by the dual-purpose assault gun / mortar systems and rockets. These were hit heavily in the parking lot at this time in conjunction with the air-to-ground munitions and, of course, the loitering munition strikes as others moved into the area seeking refuge in this large structure known as the Dallas Cowboys football stadium. As the football stadium was also a key objective of the PLA forces, as it could be used for multiple mission purposes by the PLA armed forces, the building was wanted as much intact as possible, naturally, and they would be sending in a full company of their mechanized infantry dismounted squads and their 3 combat platoons to seize control of the structure. As the PLA had lost no casualties outside of the stadium, they would lose casualties inside of the stadium due to the diverse layout of the stadium itself, as the stadium was effectively different from many other building types which the PLA was quite used to clearing and doing efficiently. The stadium, with its rounded, multi-floor, large concrete corridors, its different vendor shops, its open seating area, and the field itself would prove a challenge to these platoons as they moved through the area. Hence, it was required and effectively advised by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system that the entire company was needed to clear this building, as again, due to all these challenges of the building layout. As the combat in the outside of the building, again, was mostly a slaughter on the defending forces, one company having moved in to provide direct fire against the forces using the edges of the structure as a means by which to fight back against the vehicles, doing nothing to the vehicles with their small arms, whereby in response, the 12.7 millimeter equipped Type 89A APCs and the heavy weapon-equipped ZBDO-4A infantry fighting vehicles, as these ZBDO-4As had a 100mm main gun, an attached 30mm autocannon next to it, a 7.62 by 54mm coaxial machine gun, and a dual-pod HJ09 ATGM launching system, as the Type 89As were equipped with a simple machine gun turret, as they could equip their W85 heavy 12.7mm machine guns. These two were devastating weapons, and these vehicles were effectively an armored mobile gun platform to provide fire support to their dismounted squads as they advanced. As the dismounts also carried an array of different weapon systems, everything from their standard QBZ-95 rifles to their QBJ-201 light machine guns, which had an excessively high rate of fire and were a terrifying weapon to be on the receiving end of, to their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade systems, or their HJ-08 man-portable ATGM systems, which gave the standard infantrymen the ability to effectively bust tanks and other heavy vehicles. These were also effective against buildings as well, as many armed reactionary civilians were taking cover anywhere they could, and thus these weapons would not only be sanctioned for use, but would be effective when advancing against the stadium itself, as these different platoons moved in to seize the building. As the combat outside, again, was mostly a one-sided exchange, as the PLA forces, with their heavy weapons, their vehicle-based weapons, their loitering munition weapons, their dedicated combat drone weapons, as to the south of the stadium, across this drainage ditch, was a shop and a parking lot wherein some armed reactionary civilians had taken cover, and CM502KG dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missiles, as they could penetrate battleship armor, which was impressive for a missile of this design, were fired at this building and the personnel running outside of it by this Wingloom 2 dedicated combat drone, as these vehicles had 360-degree security with their staggered weapons, with their gunners each taking a 180-degree or half-circle field of fire. They had interlocking fields of fire and could tactically assist one another throughout the length of this vehicle convoy of the combat platoons, as these forces, and at the opening, were being slightly engaged, as they have green here, before the fire had been called in through their quadcopter squad/vehicle crew ISR assets, which gave the precise coordinates for the dual-purpose assault gun/mortar strikes from the PLL-05 dual-purpose weapon systems. The vehicle-based fires were also utilized against these forces, as were strikes from these HE warhead-equipped loitering munitions. Again, an airstrike had been called in through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, utilizing coordinates from the quadcopter assets of the ground forces, and as these forces moved in the north from the northernmost company, they were slightly engaged by this grouping of armed reactionary civilians, breaking up and running in two general directions, one grouping trying to get to the building, while the other grouping tried to fight directly in this parking lot against these dismounted forces as they began to move in to seize the building. They too were struck by loitering munition strikes, as well as also ground-based fire from the ground forces, as these forces would drop in the prone or kneeling position and return fire against the armed reactionary civilian forces in the parking lot. As there were still some cars in the parking lot, these offered some concealment, but definitely not cover, as the heavy weapons would not only shred right through these vehicles and turn them into scrap metal, but even the standard rifle fire from the QBZ-95s was enough to rip right through these vehicles and hit the personnel on the other end. The vast majority of these armed reactionary civilians had not invested in body armor or any other types of protective equipment, and thus were relatively simple to dispatch by these infantry dismounts, as well as also their enormous amount of support from their combat drones, their loitering munitions, as their combat drones like the Wingling 2s were basically flying missile-carrying vehicles, air-based vehicles, and these were effectively kamikaze drones, these CH-901A loitering munitions with their HE warheads, as well as the air support, the 130mm rocket support, and the 120mm mortar support, as well as the vehicle-based fire support from the 12.7mm heavy machine guns on the Type 89As, and all of the weapons that were on the ZBDO-4A made light work of these forces, as at the opening these technicals are completely destroyed by these forces before they even got to this area, as they had fired at these vehicles from further away as they moved in, coming off the road into the parking area. They destroyed all these vehicles before these troops were even dismounted and before they even made for the building. As there were personnel leaving the building attempting to fight their way out, they were completely slaughtered as they tried to flee, while others barely made it inside with their lives. The sniper spotter teams as well contributed to some kills in this instance, although they contributed in a minor way. Their attacks definitely had an effect on the defending forces, as some of them thought that they had some cover behind this walled-in area within which the stadium sat. These sniper spotter teams on higher buildings could rain down death from the proper angles, and also the vehicle-based fires were shredding right through the wall in many cases as well. And also, of course, the quadcopter assets called in mortar strikes, which ended many of these personnel, in addition to sniper fire, as well as even some loitering munition strikes and vehicle-based fires, which again tore through the wall with relative ease. As the angle and traverse of these weapons would shift to firing at personnel that were returning fire from outside of the stadium, many that were firing from positions along the edges of the stadium on multi-tiered floors would be ripped to shreds by these vehicle-based systems, as the vehicles were offering fire support at the higher levels so that their troops moving in at the lower levels could enter tactically. As they breached the building, they began to take heavy fire from the defending forces and would have to vigorously fight their way in and through the building in order to capture it again. As the PLA lost no casualties outside of the building, they would suffer casualties while trying to seize it, as there were 800 defenders inside of this building, and there was no rhyme or reason, so to speak, as to how they were deployed throughout the building. Many were in random areas and had to be thoroughly cleared, and sometimes it got to the point where bayonets and hand grenades were used in many areas to eradicate these forces, as hand-to-hand combat would break out, as there were so many hiding places within the stadium within which had to be thoroughly cleared by the different platoons and their comprising squads entering the facility. As the PLA forces of one company had entered to seize the building, they would lose close to 2 full squads of troops, KIA and WIA combined, while they tried to take this building. In the other side of the city, in its eastern end, in the smaller pocket, the forces were now clearing their own flanks as they moved in, as this company had dismounted all of their platoons, all 3 combat platoons, and had sent them to clear the northern flank of this area, as the vehicle-based forces were pushing the main body of the armed reactionary civilians into a deadly pocket within which they would be annihilated. As this map opens up, the dismounted squads of these combat platoons, the 3 combat platoons from this northernmost company that's along I-30 here, are moving through these mixed commercial and residential areas in their different tactical formations. As mentioned before, they have deployed their quadcopter assets to look for any forms of resistance anywhere in these residential/commercial areas. as they move through tactically with their staggered weapons as their point man faces front. Man behind them is scanning his sector, this man scanning his sector, and this man scanning their sector. They utilize their quadcopter assets to race ahead of them and call in precise coordinates for strikes while also aiding the AI target seeking mode on the loitering munitions, which are also directly aiding them in this operation from above, as the AI target seeking mode would find priority targets to strike at the behest of the ground forces operating in this area. As this wedge formation of troops moves into this area, they break into two half squads and begin to move through the backyards of these homes along the street, as there are armed reactionary civilians that have been spotted first by the quadcopter asset of the squad as they plan to move down the street. They deployed their forces like so, and simply came up onto them as they tried to flee, as they briefly exchanged fire when they got to this point. They came in through the back and cut them down as they fled, as the quadcopter assets on the squad NCO's monitor, his combat data link, could show exactly where these forces were and effectively vector their fire in that direction, as their fire simply shredded through the building materials of these small homes and cut these forces down, as it was highly concentrated 5.8 by 42 millimeter fire, in addition to light anti-armor weapons like the Type 69s, which also had anti-personnel rounds, which were fragmentation rockets, as well as also HJ-08 man-portable anti-tank guided missiles. As this grouping up here was on the move as well, it has to always be remembered that multiple actions are occurring at the same time. As this squad moved up here, this squad moved up here, while this squad and this squad were moving through this apartment complex, along with this squad moving through this commercial area, moving through this building quickly before bounding to the office, the rental office. As this squad in this rolling T formation had made it at this point in the parking lot, they now vector their fire in this direction, making it possible for this squad to advance into the rental office and assist in finishing them off as they were taking cover behind it. They used their quadcopters to find them. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system guided the movements of all these forces right down to the tactical level, meaning at the squad and vehicle crew level, and coordinated their movements together in terms of full platoon operations and larger, as this squad that had moved into this neighborhood with this squad now reached this point, and this squad had reached this point. They vectored their fire and cut these forces down, allowing for this squad to move in here and cut these personnel down before the squad shifted in their wedge formation back to this area where they vectored fire with these forces at these forces here who tried to flee and were cut down as a result. As all of this was unfolding, this wedge formation, this rolling T formation, this rolling T formation, and this double column formation were moving into this apartment complex right here, along with this rolling T formation. This was another platoon operation. As they were moving through the apartment complex, there was yet another platoon that was clearing this area to the west. As these forces moved through this apartment complex due to the building layouts and the height of the buildings, there were ample hiding places in these buildings, but again, these were relatively small apartments, and at the time, there were nobody but non-combatants hiding within, and they took no fire from these buildings, although they took proper precautions and used the proper tactical formations like the rolling T, and this rolling T formation moving into this area made it possible for this wedge to advance. They were all mutually supporting each other, each of these squads, as they moved through tactically. As this rolling T formation left this building, this shop, along the highway, along the access road here, they moved through the fencing and into the complex. And by the time they got here and this squad got to this corner, they could vector their fire effectively through the courtyards of these apartments, and they cut down these individual armed personnel who had fled their buildings and were trying to effectively leave the complex. But they were cut down and they never made it. As these squads were carrying out this operation, it made it possible for this squad to continue moving to this position here while this squad was moving up here. They then bounded and took a corner before moving here while this squad was cutting these personnel down, and they held their position here in order to be in a position to support their other squads in the area, and vice versa. The squad continued to hold their position along this road. There were terrain denial strikes that were occurring that were also being done with 130 millimeter multiple launch rocket fire to prevent retreat from this general area, as well as also 155 millimeter shelling from the PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers of the 16th Infantry Division's Artillery Battalion. As all of this was occurring and these forces were trying to flee the complex, they were hit heavily by 130 millimeter rockets, 155 millimeter shelling, and loitering munition strikes from CH-901As. These particular CH-901As from this battalion, as opposed to the other battalion in the west, were equipped with the fragmentation warheads and were absolutely devastating beyond belief on dismounted forces as well as soft-skinned vehicles. In this area, 120 millimeter mortar strikes were occurring from the heavy assault gun / mortars, the PLL-05s, as they too partook in this operation as the fire support company with its rocket and mortar systems struck this particular area, as the 130 millimeter Type 63 rockets, again, were also not only partaking in a terrain denial strike, but were also eliminating a large number of defending forces as they tried to flee this neighborhood, this apartment complex. As this squad moved through the area and this squad moved through the area, these personnel, these armed reactionary civilians that had been in this building, there were a total of 25 of them, had fled into this church, and they were spotted by the time this squad got here as their quadcopters were running a circuit through this area to map this area in real time. They were spotted as they got into the church, where they stayed for a brief time before fleeing the church to go to another building on the church grounds, and they were hit by 155 millimeter strikes as a result of the quadcopter assets being linked in to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which put together the pre-prepared strike packages, sent it to the artillery FDC, which then passed it down to the gun lines who fired these fire missions against these armed reactionary civilians, and they were promptly destroyed along with this church building on the grounds with 155 millimeter shells. All 25 of them KIA'd. By that point in time, this squad had since moved through this area as they were taking fire from this grouping that was moving through this neighborhood. As they exchanged fire briefly, the shelling came into this area as they were safely at enough of a distance away. It was still relatively danger close, but the calculations of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had deemed it safe for the strike. Again, cutting down on friendly fire casualties drastically, as there are so many different movements unfolding at roughly the same time or near the same time. Covering these operations is often difficult, but again, it will be attempted as always to the highest degree of precision possible. As this grouping moved into this area, they would be hit by a 120 millimeter mortar strike, which landing in this area of the street, along with these 155 shells landing here, would destroy this entire section of this neighborhood on the street. All four of these houses completely annihilated, along with this grouping that had briefly exchanged fire with this squad as it moved through this area and temporarily paused at this street corner before then advancing further, as more shells had come in and hit these groupings near the very opening of this map, or 45 minutes in, as they were spotted by their quadcopter assets at the opening when they were in this position here, and their quadcopters were running their circuit. As this grouping also tried to flee, they too were hit by 155 shell strikes. Loitering munition strikes came in and destroyed these technicals. This one was about to pull out of a driveway as there were armed civilians from this house that lived here that were trying to flee and were spotted and would be hit by the AI target-seeking mode on these loitering munitions. This grouping here by these shops would also be hit as well. Again, this grouping struck by both a 120 millimeter mortar strike and a fragmentation warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munition strike. Heavy artillery strikes and rocket strikes at the north of this apartment complex destroyed these groups that tried to flee their neighborhood, or this apartment complex, in other words, as these squads moved in and cut these forces down. Loitering munition here. There was a fence line here with which the squad ran through and also offered up fire, as these squads had an L vector of fire tactically. And then when this squad moved here, they fired in this direction. As these forces were trying to flee, they were hit by shelling. This was a rather large operation. Although it was against a relatively small pocket of armed reactionary civilians, there were an enormous number of actions that were unfolding, as this was another company, or a second company after this company here, moving into the area. At the opening, they paused as these precision munitions were dropped on this block, eradicating a grouping of buildings within which there were dozens of armed reactionary civilians, before dropping more at the very opening to hit this area right here. These were precision munitions. As this grouping was running in, they too were being annihilated by these munitions, as thousands of pounds of precision munitions were dropped from these three JH-7s flying over this area. This whole grouping annihilated. As this arrow is encapsulated in red, this green arrow, these forces were also eradicated as the strikes destroyed all of these buildings right here. Before this grouping moved in here, they then would take position here, exchanging fire with these forces, who would then try to flee, as they would be cut down in flight, as well as a mortar strike coming in, called in from the quadcopter assets, firing another 120mm mortar strike due to the proper exact coordinates from this grouping trying to flee this gas station along the highway. As loitering munition strikes were also prevalent in this area, many fragmentation warhead-equipped loitering munitions were striking these large groupings. As there were more off-map, again, this was a whole main grouping of 300 of them just off the map that were being surrounded by two other mechanized infantry companies, as the other 4 of 6 mechanized infantry companies operated in this area and, again, cleared their own northern flanks. As this grouping was moving in here of armed reactionary civilians through this housing neighborhood, which was mostly clear according to the quadcopter overflights, this small grouping was destroyed by vehicle-based fire from the heavy machine gun-equipped armored personnel carriers, the Type 89As. The W-85 12.7mm machine gun turrets simply cut them down as they came up the street. And as this grouping continued its movement, they exchanged fire with this grouping at the opening and basically destroyed this grouping. As the rest tried to flee, they continued to vector and traverse their weapons accordingly and fire at them as they tried to flee. As that was occurring, there were 2 platoons and a 3rd platoon of the combat platoons from the southernmost company that had swept in from this area. As again, the quadcopter overflights saw virtually no resistors in this area, although again there was a small grouping right here. They had swung down to the south and were now moving up to link up with this company as they would push the main body into the area that was surrounded by the other 2 companies off map, which also would be strafed by 23mm nose cannon fire from the JH-7 strike aircraft, as well as also hit by precision munitions and also artillery fire from the 155mm PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers of the 16th Infantry Division's own artillery battalion, firing into this area. As the fighting in this pocket would be more short-lived than the fighting over the stadium, as to seize the stadium would take several hours. The fighting in this neighborhood, including all of the infantry actions in the northern quadrant of this 1.5 by 1 mile map, this combat operation in total would take 2 hours' time, as for all these forces to move throughout these neighborhoods and for these vehicles to both surround and heavily pummel the remaining 300 armed reactionary civilians would take 2 hours to complete. Again, though, the capture of the stadium would take longer, as that would take several hours to move through that building and completely clear it of all resistance. As these forces were moving into the area, and the dismounted platoons of the northernmost company were moving through these neighborhoods tactically, using their heavy firepower advantage with all the support they received from their own artillery, their 155mm artillery, their 120mm heavy mortars, their 130mm rocket strikes being utilized in a terrain denial operation, using their advantage in tactical formations, the vehicle-based firepower as well. This operation was effectively a decisive PLA victory, of course, as, again, these forces moved to link up in this area to all push forward to surround and destroy the rest of the 300 main body of the armed reactionary civilians in this pocket. In this area here, there was a precision artillery strike called in as a fire mission for this apartment building that had been called in, along with the heavy mortar strikes in this area, which destroyed all these forces as they tried to flee through the courtyard, as well as this grouping here along this commercial building were trying to flee. They were hit by a 120mm strike and destroyed this whole grouping, as well as also loitering munition strikes, which also hit these personnel as they tried to flee in tandem with vehicle-based fire coming from the lead infantry fighting vehicles of these companies, of their lead platoons, as the very powerful ZBDO-4As fired 100mm shell fire, 30mm autocannon fire, like so, as they fired their 100mm shell fire, 30mm autocannon fire, and even in some instances, their HJ-09 ATGMs, as well as their coax machine gun fire, 7.62x54, these vehicles were absolutely hellishly destructive on their opposition and completely assisted in the total absolute annihilation of the defending forces in this particular area. As again, these highway systems, both I-20 and I-30, were absolutely vital to the war effort and the occupation to follow the victory in this invasion, as these would serve as key logistical resupply routes for the invasion forces, who, at least initially, were using back roads such as these to be relatively stealthy in their endeavor of bringing supplies forward from their CCP regime properties to their forward units, as the headquarters and support companies in each battalion were responsible for the main logistical resupply operations, as they worked directly with the headquarters platoons of each combat company, delivering them supplies, as well as also running back to the CCP regime properties to get more, including interacting with the division level forces of the two brigade headquarters of each brigade, which comprised the division, as the division headquarters of headquarters company itself was mostly an administrative and command element. The two brigade headquarters battalions were the two biggest logistical elements within the entire 16th Infantry Division, and they sat on the largest supply caches out of all the division's supply caches on each and every CCP regime property, as the supplies were seemingly endless. This was mostly because they had been built up for decades, literally, as tiny bands of armed reactionary civilians would make feeble attempts to attack some of these logistical resupply elements. They would respond with heavy firepower from their escorts, as sometimes they would use either infantry fighting vehicles or armored personnel carriers to escort their logistical forces forward. These small groupings would be discovered by the constant patrolling quadcopter assets, as well as also the high-altitude reconnaissance assets which constantly circled the entire battlefield, along with even satellite assets forming the highest level of the surveillance apparatus of the PLA's ISR capabilities, as they had the most wide-reaching surveillance apparatus on the face of the Earth, between their lowest level quadcopter assets to their high altitude drones and spy aircraft, all the way up to their satellites, as the Chinese had the most military satellites of any nation on Earth, although not the most commercial, at least not yet. Although when they conducted their tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes, they removed all of the American commercial satellites as well, so that the American armed forces could not piggyback off of these and use them in the case of losing their military satellites. Although the military satellites have been targeted first, the commercial satellites were targeted in follow-up salvos of the hard-kill anti-sat weapons, such as the DN2s, DN3s, S-500s, and others. As now, in the combat unfolding in Arlington, the decisive battle had been decided in the favor of the PLA forces. They would capture their football stadium that they coveted for military usage, as well as control the local highway networks that ran through Arlington, and also eradicate the vast majority of the armed mobs, which were effectively leaderless. They lacked any cohesion and effective logistical resupply networks. They were just reacting in the meantime to the invasion without any actionable intel, without any centralized command and control and leadership, and without proper anti-armor and anti-air weapons or air defense weapons. These forces were absolutely crushed under the weight of the might of the local PLA units operating in the area. As all of this was underway, many other battles were unfolding as well at the stroke of midnight and beyond, as also to the northeast of the downtown of Dallas, in the northeast Dallas / Garland area, another mechanized infantry battalion from the 16th ID had raced up I-35W, up I-30 before departing and moving into the area to clear the flanks before hurriedly moving on to surround and destroy the 2nd of the 142nd, which they would be aided in this endeavor with the use of tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes from the PLA strategic missile forces, as well as also heavy strategic bombing, as their site in Richardson was the site of the Raytheon plant and office buildings, which had been moved from their previous site in Garland down into Richardson, as these forces had been deployed to defend this vital military-industrial site. They lacked any air defense capabilities, as, again, the Americans were not sure what they were exactly defending against, as they had no real intelligence. All they knew was that there was a possibility of some kind of attack, and it could happen anywhere or all kinds of places throughout the nation. And again, they deployed their forces haphazardly, as they were slow to mobilize, and they were spread very thin. And the limited military-industrial complex of the United States, as its production capacity was very limited, and it was a relatively small military-industrial base overall, would be heavily pounded to the ground through a combination of strategic air raids from heavy strategic bomber aircraft, such as these H-20 stealth aircraft or the H-6Ks, as well as also tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes, and also heavy artillery bombardment. As in the next video installation of this hypothetical documentary invasion series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines through the guise of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, the combat in both the northeast of Dallas, and also north-central Dallas, or Richardson, just an outer suburb of Dallas, will be covered in the next installation of this documentary series. More to come in the next video